Hello everyone, Professor Sexton, and this is a brief video lecture on poetic terminology. So the poetic terminology sheet you can find in course documents. I'm just going to go over this very briefly by reading the things on the sheet. And then when we go to the separate, the other video lecture on Robert Hayden, Those Winter Sundays, and Theodore Recky's My Papa's Waltz, we'll talk about more of these things in detail. To make this easier, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the poetic terminology sheet. So you should be able to see it. There we are. And I will just make it larger there for you. So first thing first, with poetic terminology, I do want to distinguish there's a difference between what the subject of the poem is and the theme of the poem is. The subject of the poem is like the main topic. So the main topic can be love, or the main topic can be revenge. The theme is what the poem says about that subject. So if the poem says that love is great or that revenge is natural, then that's the theme. So just keep clear in your mind that the theme always tells you something about the subject. Like for instance, the two poems that we're going to talk about in the next lecture are both about father-son relationships. Those are the subjects. But if I were to ask you what the themes are about the father-son relationships, then that is what the poems say about that subject. Now, keep in mind, there are no real right or wrong answers when it comes to discussing in poetic terminology in terms of subject and themes. The strength of how you look at this depends on how well you support your view. And in supporting your view, you always want to use the poem itself. So look at what lines and look at what happens in the poem to support your argument. So if you said that Theodore Recky's poem is about the complexities of father-son's relationships, that's your theme. But then you need to go back and it's like, what in the poem shows that complexity? And that's when you'll want to quote lines and stuff like that. The next topic is paraphrase. All a paraphrase is when you put the poem in your own words. So, for instance, sometimes when you're reading a poem, it's not always easy to understand the language that the poem is in. So what you can do here instead is reword the poem in your own language. The other things that I wanted to point out to you, there's a difference between speaker and persona. The speaker is the person speaking the poem. So whoever is the I of the poem is the speaker. The persona is the character or identity of that speaker. The thing that I want you to be certain of here, do not assume that the poet is the speaker. Like for instance, if you go back to Gwendolyn Brooks' We Real Cool, in Gwendolyn Brooks' We Real Cool, the persona of those people speaking that poem is a group of teenagers. That's not Gwendolyn Brooks. Gwendolyn Brooks is not speaking that poem. So when you hear "we real cool, we skip school," that's not Gwendolyn Brooks talking. She's doing that in the persona of the young teenagers that she's talking about. So you want to make sure that you distinguish that. Lines and stanzas are the individual, and there's no better way to describe this than using the actual words. The individual lines of a poem, those are the line. So, like for instance, the Shakespearean sonnet is 14 lines long. So, line one is line one, the last line is line 14. Sometimes poems are grouped into little sections, and those groups are called a stanza. I'll point that out more so when we get to Robert Hayden, Those Winter Sundays, and I'll show you a better example of what that is. Enjambment is when a line does not, when the end of a line does not have a punctuation mark. And this is very important when you're reading a poem. When you're reading a poem, you always read until you get to the next punctuation mark. The end of a line may not have a punctuation mark, and if it does not have a punctuation mark, that's called enjambment. Um, Diction, these are the words that the poet chooses to use, and they can make all the difference. When we start talking about Theodore Recky's My Papa's Waltz, I will explain a little bit more how diction works, but it's word choice, and that word choice affects the way that we understand or how we encounter a poem. Syntax is the word order. So if you're thinking about it this way, the typical English sentence, we normally begin the typical English sentence by putting the subject first and then the verb. Like for instance, I would say, my sister and I are going to the store. My sister and I are the subject, are going is the verb. So syntax is the word order. Sometimes, however, poets invert the syntax, and so they might change it. And so they might put the verb first. And so rewording something in a different syntax can change the way we encounter it. A movie example is Yoda. If any of you are fans of Star Wars or have ever seen a Star Wars movie, Yoda uses inverted syntax. So whenever Yoda speaks, he gives the verb first and subject. For instance, Yoda might say something such as, run, you must, walk, you will. That is not how we typically speak those things. We will say, you will walk, you will run, but Yoda plays with the syntax. This other group is a big group of words here. So figurative language just distinguish between what is actually written and what is meant. And think about the word, for instance, think about the word heart. Heart is, if you think of the literal heart, that's that physical organ in our body. But then think about the ways that we use heart to symbolize love and things of that nature, which bleeds into the second one, symbol, where something can stand for something else. So as we approach Valentine's Day, know how often, I'm just going to, know how often we use the heart shape to symbolize love. That's a symbol. Irony is the difference between what is actual stated and what is meant. This can be debatable because people could read things differently. Simile is comparing two dissimilar items such as like or as, using like or as. For instance, there's a poem that begins with, my love is like a red, red rose. So that's comparing the speaker's love to a rose. But because the speaker uses the word like, that's a simile. Metaphor is also comparing two dissimilar things, but saying one is the other. Like, for instance, if you've ever heard the expression, war is hell, that's a metaphor. But notice there that we're not using like or as. Overstatement or hyperbole is exaggerating something. Like, for instance, on a very hot day, someone can say, it's hot as hell. Well, that's an hyperbole. That's exaggeration. Um, it's probably not as hot as hell, but it's an overstatement. And then understatement is doing the opposite, implying more than what is said. Like, for instance, if someone makes a very rude comment and you might say, oh, that's a very nice thing to say. Well, that's an understatement because that's not what you mean. You don't mean that it's nice. You mean it's a very rude comment. And you hear that in the tone of our voice. Onomatopoeia is a word that sounds like the thing that it represents. Like, for instance, if you hear tadam, tadam, so T-A-D-U-M, when you pronounce that, that sounds like the beating of a drum. And so that's onomatopoeia. Personification is when you give human characteristics to non-human objects. Like, for instance, if someone is writing a poem and says, as I walked down the street, I heard the trees speak to me and they asked me, where are you going? Well, trees don't speak to you. Um, they don't speak to you literally. They don't ask you questions using words. That's personification. And what the poet has done is he's given human characteristics or qualities to a non-human object. Allusion is when a poem makes allusion to people, places, events, or other literary works. And so they can work in very, very many different ways. So you're reading a poem, and in the poem, the poet might mention Billie Holiday. Well, that person is making an allusion to Billie Holiday. Um, Imagery is just the senses: sight, sound, taste, smell, touch that the poem invokes. So sometimes when you're reading a poem, it gives you can see something in the words of the poem, or you might hear something, or it's possible that you might smell something, or the poem might be written in such a way that it gives you this sense of touch. And then the last poetic terminology that I list here is tone. And this is the verbal indication of a speaker attitude towards the poem subject. And this is debatable because, once again, this depends on how you read the poem. So, for instance, if a speaker is writing about father-son relationship, maybe you're reading the poem, it's like this poem has a positive tone about the father-son relationship. Or you can say that the poem has a negative tone about father-son relationships. But once again, this is something that you'll have to prove by looking at lines and evidence in the poem. I know discussing these terminologies by themselves without examples don't work as that well. So what I will do is I'm providing video lectures on the different poems that we read and talk about in class. I will try to make as many references to the poetic terminology so that that might assist you to get a better sense of what these words mean. All right. Thank you very much. One more lecture and we'll talk about the two poems. Right. See you in the next time.